The grand hall of the Varn Dominion was a cathedral of alien light and steel. Thousands of dignitaries, scaled, furred, and feathered, watched as Princess Zalria of the Varn stepped onto the ceremonial dais. She was tall, slender, and proud, born of the royal bloodline that had ruled for 6 millennia. The crystalline veins in her silver skin pulsed faintly with stress. Before her stood the human delegation. They were smaller, softer-looking, their skin bare and unarmored, but there was something in their eyes, something no Varn warrior could quite define. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was certainty. At their center stood Captain Daniel Reeve of the United Terran Expeditionary Corps, the man she would marry. The crowd's murmurs rippled like thunder through the hall. A Varn royal marrying an off-worlder, a mammal from a world barely admitted to the galactic stage, was unthinkable. But it was the only way to end the Red Rift War, a brutal 2-decade conflict that had consumed 6 systems. The marriage was symbolic, a gesture of eternal peace. Or so they told her. Daniel's blue uniform shimmered under the crystalline lights as he approached. He bowed, not too low, not too proud, and when he looked up, his eyes met hers. "Princess Zalria," he said softly, his voice rich with sincerity. "For peace." She hesitated only a moment before replying. "For peace, and for the future." Their hands met in the ritual clasp. Hers, cold and metallic, laced with bioluminescent veins. His warm and human. 2 worlds, flesh and crystal, sealed a fragile truce. Months later, the human in the palace. At first, their marriage was awkward, ceremonial. Daniel was a soldier, not a diplomat. He spent most of his time studying the Varn culture, learning their language, their strange caste system, their reverence for the core spirit, a living energy that flowed through all crystalline life. To Zalria's surprise, he adapted quickly. The human didn't shrink under the gaze of her counsel. He listened, learned, and when he spoke, even the ancient Varn advisors paused to hear him. He was not loud, but every word carried weight. Humans, she realized, were unlike any species she'd known. Fragile in body, but indomitable in will. And slowly, impossibly, the ceremony became something more. At night, they spoke long after the suns dipped below the glass towers of the capital. Daniel told her of oceans that roared like beasts, of storms that cracked the skies of Earth open with lightning. She told him of the crystalline forests of Varn, where light sang through the branches. "On your world," she asked one night, "you fight even when there's no chance of victory." "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because sometimes fighting isn't about winning. It's about what you stand for." The words lingered in her like a pulse. The first betrayal. Peace, it seemed, was an illusion. 3 months after the union, the Krell Enclave, a Varn splinter faction, declared the treaty a disgrace. They viewed the marriage as corruption, royal blood tainted by mammalian weakness. Their leader, Lord Veth'Kor, was once her father's most trusted general. Now he led a rebellion from the northern Shards. The Dominion's council was divided. Some urged immediate war. Others wanted to abandon the human alliance altogether. Zalria pleaded for patience. "This union was forged for peace," she told them. "We cannot destroy it at the first challenge." But the council was unmoved. They saw her husband as a symbol of surrender. That night, she found Daniel standing on the palace balcony, staring at the twin moons. "They'll come for me next," he said simply. "I'm the easiest target." She turned to him sharply. "You would flee." He chuckled softly. "Never said that." For the first time, she saw something dangerous in his calm, something the old Varn warriors once called the flame of the void. It wasn't madness. It was focus, pure and terrifying. When war returned, the Krell did not wait. Their ships struck at dawn, ion lances carving through the crystal spires of the capital like lightning through glass. Palace alarms screamed. Servants fled. The air filled with the sound of cracking stone and burning ozone. Zalria's guards rushed her toward the evacuation corridors, but she stopped mid-run. "Where is Daniel?" "He refused escort, princess," one shouted. "He went to the outer walls." Her heart froze. The outer walls were suicide, an open plain beneath orbital bombardment. No unshielded being could survive out there. But when she reached the observation spire, she saw him, her husband, standing on the shattered causeway below, surrounded by his small team of Terran soldiers. The Varn had abandoned that section. The humans held it alone. Through the smoke and crystal dust, flashes of light cut through the chaos. Blue plasma from Varn rifles, red streaks from Terran weapons. And Daniel was in the center of it all. The human who wouldn't fall. Zalria had seen warriors fight before. She'd seen Varn champions tear through platoons with their crystalline blades. But what she witnessed that day defied everything she knew about battle. Daniel moved like a storm contained in human form. When plasma bolts tore through the air, he rolled, rose, and fired back with inhuman precision. When a Varn rebel charged with a blade of pure energy, Daniel sidestepped and shattered its core with a single strike of his pulse rifle butt. He was bleeding. Smoke clung to his armor. But he fought on, not retreating, not yielding. Even the Varn rebels hesitated. "This human, he does not fear pain," one whispered through the comms feed. Daniel shouted something she could barely hear over the storm. "Hold the line. They break, we live." And they did. 5 humans against 40 Varn warriors. And somehow, impossibly, they held the gate. When reinforcements arrived, the rebels were in retreat. The causeway was littered with glass shards and scorched armor. Daniel stood amid it all, chest heaving, blood streaking his face. He looked up toward the spire where Zalria watched. And in that moment, as fire burned behind him, he looked like something out of her people's oldest myths. Not a man. Force. A being born of flesh, driven by something her kind had long forgotten. Conviction. The turning point. When the smoke cleared, Zalria descended to the battlefield herself. Her advisors protested, but she ignored them. Daniel was leaning against the wall, one arm wrapped in a crude bandage. When he saw her, he smiled weakly. "Guess, peace talks are over." She knelt beside him. "You could have died." "Yeah," he breathed. "But then they'd win." "You think peace is still possible?" He met her gaze. "Peace isn't something you're given. It's something you fight for, every damn day." The word struck something deep within her. Deeper than fear, deeper than duty. Because she realized then that her world had grown comfortable with peace only when others paid for it. And humans never stop paying. End of Part 1 cliffhanger. That night, as the city mourned its dead, Zalria made her choice. She stood before the Dominion Council and removed her royal diadem. "If my people no longer believe in peace," she said, voice clear as glass, "then I will fight beside the one who does." The chamber fell silent. And somewhere in the darkness of the northern Shards, Lord Veth'Kor smiled, unaware that the human he sought to destroy had just awakened the oldest fire in the Varn race. The Varn was a realm built upon order. Every citizen, every crystal tower, every law, perfectly structured and unchanging. But when war returned, order shattered like glass under a hammer. And standing at the center of the fracture was a human. The counterstrike. 3 days after the siege, the palace still smoked. The wounded filled the crystal courtyards, their bioluminescent veins flickering weakly in the light. Captain Daniel Reeve refused to rest. The Varn Council wanted to withdraw their armies to the inner systems. But Daniel had another idea, one that terrified even the generals. "We go to them," he said, standing before the command table. His armor still bore the burns from the first battle. "We strike at Veth'Kor's fortress before he gathers the rest of his fleet." "Impossible," hissed Elder Thalrin. "You speak of the northern Shards. That region is death to organics. Its atmosphere burns, its storms crush ships." Daniel's reply was calm, but his eyes burned. "Then we adapt. Like humans always do." Zalria, seated beside him, said nothing. But her gaze never left him. Every word he spoke, every plan he drew in the light map. He did it not for conquest, but to end the bloodshed. He was not the monster the Varn expected. He was something else. Something more dangerous. A man who fought only when peace was worth the cost. And she knew she would follow him anywhere. Journey to the Shards. The Terran strike ship, resolute, cut through the storms like a spear of light. Varn warships followed. Sleek crystalline vessels guided by Zalria's command. For the first time in history, human and Varn fleets moved as one. As they entered the atmosphere of the northern Shards, plasma storms flickered like veins of lightning across the black clouds. Below, the surface was chaos. Fractured land, geysers of molten glass, rivers that glowed with inner heat. Somewhere in that hellscape stood Veth'Kor's fortress. Daniel stood on the bridge, watching the storm swirl beyond the viewport. His voice was quiet. "You ever think it's strange? That peace always hides in the heart of war." Zalria turned to him. "You think war can bring peace? I think people can," he said simply. "If they fight for the right reasons." She studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since their arranged marriage, she realized she no longer saw him as human or alien. Just Daniel. The battle for the Shards. The assault began at dawn. The Resolute descended through the storm, its drop bays opening like jaws of thunder. Human soldiers, armored in adaptive nanosuits, leapt into the molten air alongside crystalline Varn shock troopers. Lightning struck the ground around them, and the heat turned the horizon into a shimmering mirage. At the center of it all, Veth'Kor's fortress loomed, an obsidian tower pulsing with red energy. Thousands of Krell rebels waited, their weapons gleaming with stolen core crystals. Reeves Zalria shouted through the comms. "The outer shield must fall before our fleet can fire." "Copy that." Daniel's voice crackled through static. "We'll handle it." He moved through the battlefield like a force of nature. His rifle humming, his armor coated in dust and plasma scars. Each human under his command fought like 10 soldiers. They weren't faster or stronger, but they refused to stop. Even when wounded, they pushed forward, dragging comrades, firing until their weapons overheated. To the Varn, who believed in destiny and hierarchy, it was madness. To Daniel it was humanity. The fall of Veth'Kor. When the shield collapsed, Zalria led the charge into the fortress itself. Crystal corridors rang with gunfire and screams. At the top of the central spire she found him, Lord Veth'Kor, draped in molten armor, his eyes burning with rage. "So the royal bride crawls into war," he sneered. "To fight beside her pet human." "He is no pet," she said coldly. "He is what you could never be." Veth'Kor's massive blade ignited with red plasma. "Then he will die with you." He lunged. Zalria parried, her crystal staff crackling with energy. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber. He was stronger. his body reinforced with core infusions, but she was faster. Still, he overpowered her, driving her back toward the edge. Then, with a roar, the door behind him exploded. Daniel stepped through the fire and smoke. His armor half melted, his eyes blazing with fury. He looked like something carved from the storm itself. "Get away from my wife," he said. "The god of war." Veth'Kor turned, laughing. "You, a mortal of meat and water. You think you can face me?" Daniel dropped his broken rifle and pulled a short combat blade from his belt. "I don't think. I do." The two charged. To Zalria, what followed was not a fight, it was a revelation. Daniel's movements were primal and perfect. Every strike meant to survive. Not impress, he ducked under plasma swings, countered with explosive precision, his blade cutting deep into crystalline armor. Every time he was knocked down, he rose again, bloodied, gasping, unstoppable. Veth'Kor's laughter turned to panic. "You don't know when to die." Daniel's voice was a growl. "No human does." With one final brutal strike, Daniel drove his blade into the core of the Varn warlord. Veth'Kor froze, the red glow in his veins dimming, his body fracturing into shards of light. He fell, and for a long moment silence filled the hall. Zalria stared at her husband, his armor shattered, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He turned to her, his eyes soft again. "Told you," he whispered. "Peace doesn't come easy." Then he collapsed. The price of peace. Daniel survived, barely. The medics said no Varn could have lived through those wounds. But humans were stubborn creatures. For days, Zalria sat by his bedside in the crystalline infirmary, her hand resting on his. She watched his chest rise and fall, slow but steady. When he finally opened his eyes, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Hey," he murmured weakly, "did we win?" She smiled through tears. "You saved both our worlds." He chuckled faintly. "Guess that makes us even." Outside, the galaxy had changed. The Krell rebellion fell apart after Veth'Kor's death. The Dominion united again, this time not through fear but through choice. The humans, once seen as outsiders, were now honored as equals. In the months that followed, Zalria and Daniel became a symbol, not of a political union, but of something far greater. Of two species who learned that peace was not the absence of war, but the courage to fight for one another. Epilogue: The Legend of the Human. Years later, children across the Dominion would tell the story of the Human King. They said he fought the storms of the northern Shards with his bare hands. That when the crystal gods turned their gaze away, he stood and defied them. Zalria would only smile when she heard those tales. She never corrected them. Because in her heart, when she remembered that day, when she saw him standing in the fire, facing down an army for her, she understood why legends are born. Not because they are true, but because someone somewhere fought hard enough to deserve them. She stood once more on the balcony of the palace, the twin moons reflected in the new crystal towers. Daniel stood beside her, a faint scar still tracing his jaw. "Think they'll remember us?" he asked quietly. She took his hand. "They already do." And in the quiet night, with two worlds reborn under their reign, the stars themselves seemed to whisper the story of the human who fought like a god, and the alien princess who learned that peace could bleed, burn, and yet endure.